It's so fascinating that contemporary aerospace, people are reaching out to you as well as, people from NASA. It does feel like we're on the precipice of kind of this new age where a lot of this stuff seems to be coming out because the conventional history of a lot of these programs and companies are just, chemical combustion, nuts and bolts, it's all kind of this materialist reductionist science. But in fact, I think when you speak to a lot of the people at these organizations, they're extremely open-minded, and it's almost like science cleaved off in like the 50s or 60s and hit a cul-de-sac in kind of academia, and then aerospace just kept going. But it's this also, you have this religious valence on top of it as well, where like the early NASA missions had, Horus and Osiris. And it was like, you told me in our last interview, right? It was like Greek and Latin,
Yeah.
On symbology.
Latin.
And yeah.
First century Latin.
First century Latin.
Yeah.
That's right.
The empire.
The empire. Why do you think they kind of were paying homage to that tradition?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So first, I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay, nobody would ever give me a straight answer.
Yeah.
But I did ask.
Do you think there was somebody in charge who was like, yeah, like I know that the like Greeks had it right, and you have to sort of deal with these NHI in order to get to space, and like this is the program? Or do you think it was some emergent thing that like they were kind of softly in touch? Or maybe that's an unanswerable question. I don't know.
But. I believe that. So my own opinion about this is just my opinion after looking and talking to people that are, the people that are doing it actually, doing. Okay, so they would tell me that this was a way to pay homage to the sponsors. They call them the sponsors. And I'd ask, do they read Latin? Kind of thing, like really? And they would say, absolutely. I think that it's a large tradition that goes unacknowledged in our history.
And do you think it's sort of hermetically passed?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Absolutely it is. Yes.
But that's fascinating because that's sort of tying today's space program to like maybe, hermetically sealed, Egyptian, traditions. Like how far back does this get? It's amazing.
I know. I mean, it's definitely, it's not a Christianized veneer. So if you go to the Russian cosmist tradition, which is a similar tradition, where they believe in, like Konstantin Tchaikovsky believed in NHI and that he was, he believed in this and he wrote books about it. And he's the father of Russian rocketry. They're Christian. They have kind of a Christian overlay to this or framework. But we have Jack Parsons, definitely not a Christian. But then you do have the same, you have the impetus that stays there. It's not as weird as Jack Parsons, but it's weird enough. It's definitely not Christian. It seems to be Greco-Roman, with the recognition that there are these deities, right? And does it go back to Egypt? I don't know. I don't know. I am not an insider. So I don't have an inside track. I just can spot the myth that's being called a myth, but it's actually real, that they're like, they are doing this intentionally.
Well, I think that's kind of this myth in disclosure overall. Cause like both of us are on the outside, but we've like poked, we've poked around. Like we have like a decent mental map that's probably like better than just the average person who's like not really, interested in this stuff. Right. And like my serious inclination now that was not the case a few years ago is that there's like no one in charge, or that like if there is something in charge, it's this like loosely distributed weird thing that's like emerging and has like a mind of its own. And maybe there are some people kind of tapped into deeper layers of reality, but it's certainly not commensurate with some clearance system or classification system within the government.
Yeah. That's okay. So I'm fully on board with that theory. And, cause we can't prove it, can we?
Yeah.
But it's just a theory, but I'll give you some examples.
But we've met enough people who like, people on the outside are like, that's the deep state architect of the godfather of the UFO stuff. And like, we meet them and they're like, well, they don't know a lot of stuff that this other person knows.
That's
and there's like a lot of that going on.
Yeah, a lot of it. So that made me actually think about the oral tradition of it, because I was around enough people to know that they figured out their missions not from asking people or having someone tell them. They had to figure it out on their own.
Yeah.
And that process was hard for them. And they didn't even know that they got it right until they got an award for it like 2 years later.
Yeah.
So they didn't know. And they would also tell me things like, well, people were on this mission, but they never knew until they got the card, or not the card, the patch.
Yeah.
Until they got the patch or whatnot, or they figured it out. And so I was beginning to see it as, when I have friends that are indigenous, and they occasionally tell me a couple of things, about their worldview and the way that their like Australian Aboriginal culture works, right? And apparently there's like a very succinct and transmissible oral tradition that is really old, like, 30,000 years old or something like that. And it has to do with, NHI and things like that. And so I began to see our space program like that, like, wow, that's how it works. There's an oral tradition that's transmitted, but it's not transmitted through this memo. So the declassified memos, what do they really mean, when there's this type of tradition?
Yeah, well, all the memos seem like they're kind of groping in the dark, and they don't really know what these things are. I'm a big fan of this mid-century inventor, Townsend Brown, who we talked about earlier with Carl Nell. And he says it's like, fish in the water. They don't know, the hull, they just see the hulls of the ships over top, but they have no idea what those ships are transporting or why they're there. And that really, feels like where we're at. But you bring up this idea of a patch. What do you mean by that?
Okay, so the patches. So in the Space Force, or whatever we call it today, where people are on missions to send things up into space, satellites or what have you, they work on these and they get these patches. Okay, so a lot of people know about these patches. They have a Roman god on them or something like that. And they usually have the Latin that describes the mission, but in a way that's really opaque and even making fun of outsiders, right? So this is the mission. You could even, go online and see a lot of those patches. And I've known someone to have like at least 150 of these patches.
Whoa.
Yeah. So this is a person whose whole life has been doing this work.
Wow. Well, I think about the person you pseudonymously named Tyler in your book, and he's this NASA mission controller. It seems like he's using kind of consciousness protocols to make the launches work. He's this very interesting figure. But then he goes to the Vatican with you, and he has this conversion experience. And it's almost as if what he looks into in the Vatican archives confirms that the work that he's been doing is somehow mystical and like way more like globally meaningful than just this nuts and bolts, like we're putting satellites in space sort of thing.
Yeah, that was really an amazing experience for me to witness the conversion that he went through. We started at the Vatican looking at the records of Joseph of Cupertino and a bilocating sister, Maria of Agreda. And we also had exposure to Peter Gumpel, who had been a papal advisor, who's a Jesuit, talked a lot about the Templars, by the way.
Interesting.
Yeah. And
do you remember what he said about the Templars?
I do. Okay.
Moving on.
So that's where it started. So he started to re-examine his life, I guess.
Yeah.
And I could see that process because I've seen it before. And I had a feeling that when we got to Castel Gandolfo at the Vatican Observatory, where he was going to meet astrophysicist monks and, those people that live like that, they have, that's their mission. And their mission is it fuses religion and science. I knew that would be his place and that he would probably convert at that point. And I was right. So then we left the Vatican and we went there. And then he spent a lot of time in the archives looking at Copernicus and Kepler, and, originals, by the way, and also looking at electromagnetism.
It's amazing.
And things like that. And I just couldn't get him out of the archive, just glued to these books.
It's incredible. And the other thing I wanted to follow up on from our first interview is you said this remarkable thing, and I kind of I don't know, I ignored it. Bad interviewer in my case or something, because you said this really profound thing. You said that when you went with Tyler to the Vatican Observatory, they knew who he was before having gone there. And that tripped me out when I was watching it over in the edit, because I was like, why does the Vatican Observatory, they're obviously very well respected and well staffed when it comes to real astronomy, but how do they know who a NASA mission controller from the US is?
Yeah, not only that, but when we were there, we just happened to correspond with a trip that all these young scientists from ESA, so the European Space Agency, they were all there too. And so Brother Guy, who's the director, Guy Consolmagno, he was giving them, a really awesome tour and talk and everything. So he introduced us. And so he introduced me, and they were like, kind of cool, clap, clap, clap. And they introduced Tyler with his real name, and the whole place just erupted into just, yes, like that. And that was a recognition for me that Americans kind of don't know what's going on, but they did. Yeah, they were, to them, he was a hero. Yeah, it was really, really cool.
That's incredible. The other interesting connection with Tyler is he met Chris Bledsoe, I think, or before
That's
you.
right.
I
Yes,
think.
he did. Yeah.
And they had a relationship. And I think Ryan Bledsoe, who's Chris's son, said that Tyler had told Chris that he was part of a group with Townsend Brown, who I just mentioned. So Townsend Brown's this like fascinating mid-century inventor who I think, made more discoveries in the world of gravity than meet the eye, might have tied gravity and electromagnetism together. And that has implications for time as well, because if you can shift gravity at all, you can shift time and general relativity.
Yeah.
And he would talk in his private life constantly about time travel. And so what I found just so fascinating is Tyler tells the Bledsoes that he was involved with a group that was based in Nassau in the Bahamas. And Townsend Brown was the president of this group, and time travel technology was involved. And I would totally discount that and think that's probably wrong if I didn't know so much about Townsend Brown. And I know he spent a ton of time in Nassau in the Bahamas, and with a very interesting kind of cast of characters.
Well, that's so fascinating, because when I knew Tyler, he was always talking about time travel. And
really?
Yeah, whenever a new movie about time travel would come out, he would go see it.
Like the Adjustment Bureau.
Yeah.
Or the
He
Philip
loved
K.
it.
Dick.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
So
I mean, wow.
That's amazing.
It seems like we both know. So you're kind of like the person who talks about Brown, right? And then he's an invisible, or he was until you, right?
Yeah,
and then when I met Tyler, that's what I thought. I thought more people have to know about this person.
Yeah.
Because he's an invisible, but he impacts so much of our history, and we don't even know it.
That's the way, yes.
Yeah.
I felt the same way. I felt like it was my duty or something, because he died penniless. And I'm convinced his work made it into the B-2 stealth bomber. This premier, stealth bomber. And he was paid off by this financier at Northrop Grumman, like a ridiculously low sum of money for the rest of his life. And then not even that. I mean, I think he literally like unified the field experimentally. And so like
that's so sad.
Everybody knows who. Even Tesla got ripped off, but people know who he is, and he has a great car company named after him today. Nobody knew who this guy was.
Right.
And he was such a patriot. He was such an American patriot. It was Cold War era. And so these discoveries obviously have implications for, weaponry and all sorts of other things. And so he created tons of disinfo about his own work to throw people off the trail. And so he kind of died penniless in obscurity on Catalina Island. And so you felt this, you felt the same duty with Tyler.
I don't know what I felt. I felt a sense that you have, like a sense of injustice, kind of, that we want the world to be transparent.